Welcome to the Determined Truth Podcast.
Want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Where we aim to explore questions of truth, the scriptures, and what it means for the church today. Here are your hosts, Rob Dalrymple and Vinnie Angelo.
Hey everyone, welcome into our second episode of Passion Week on the podcast. So if you didn't listen to the last episode already, you definitely want to go back and revisit that. Kind of quit doing an impromptu commercial. We definitely want to get our podcast out there. We're not doing it to build college money for the kids. It's something that we want to bless people with, and it's been your heart for years on this. But we're also learning that the more you guys as listeners are involved, the more you can help us. Right. And so one of the things that you can do even right now, pause this episode or after you're done with this one, whatever app you're listening, whether it's Podbean or Apple or Spotify or whatever, go into the show and like it, give it 5-star review, and even add a review in there. Like say, hey, we love the podcast. It's a blessing, whatever. These sorts of things actually helps it get in the algorithm and into the loop better, and more people have an opportunity to see this.
We're going to put a lot of notes in the show notes. So if you're listening right now and you haven't looked at the show notes, go ahead and go back and stop and go look at the show notes, because I'm going to give an outline of all the verses that we're doing.
Do you want to give a summary real quick, Rob, of what we went over in that last episode?
Yeah, we've been working through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, trying to provide the Gospels and the best that we can, figure out what happened on that Thursday night into Friday. We've gone from the disciples coming into the upper room, sitting down, having a meal, Jesus washing the disciples' feet, Judas deciding to leave the meal. Judas has left the building. And Jesus then institutes what we call communion at the Last Supper there. And now they're about to leave the house, and we'll pick it up from there. Okay.
So you now have the situation where Jesus predicts what Peter's going to do when he denies. Still in the upper room.
Right.
And so this change is happening there, because everything happening before this is like Jesus is still teaching and they're having this shared moment of feet washing and whatnot, but now the mood is shifting.
Yes. Now, again, the Gospels aren't consistent on this. The Gospel of John places this in the upper room in John 14:31.
Yeah.
But the Gospel of Matthew places this in the garden. They've already left, and he's in the garden where Jesus says, "Hey, guess what?" Peter says in John 13:36 and 37, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus says, "Well, where I go, you can't follow me now, but you will follow me later." And Peter said, "Lord, why can't I follow you right now? I'll lay down my life for you." And again, you got to stop there, because what Jesus is saying is, you're going to go to a cross later, Peter, but you can't follow me now. And Peter's like, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I'll lay down my life for you." And it's like, exactly. That's exactly the whole point. It just won't happen now. Mm-hmm. Then Luke's gospel, and this will be a big issue that we're going to talk about on our next Luke podcast. And Luke 22:31-34, Jesus says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat." Now, the word "you" there in Luke 22:31 is plural. It's not just Simon. So he's addressing Simon. Remember this honor and shame culture, this hierarchical culture. Peter is the leader. Simon, Simon, Satan's demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and that once you've turned again, strengthen your brothers. And he said, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death." And he said, "I say to you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you've denied me 3 times that you know me." Now, we're also going to talk about, to kind of put in a plug for our next Luke podcast that you and I are going to do. We're going to talk about the fact that you have to read this in light of the spiritual warfare between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the devil. And this goes back to the Genesis again also, because the whole storyline of the biblical story is the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman constantly being at war with each other. You will bruise his heel and he will crush your head. That's exactly what's happening now in the gospel story. That's why Satan is so prominent in these stories, because this is really what's happening.
In John's gospel in 14, 15, 16, you have this farewell discourse, which is going to be, there's so much happening in these 3 chapters, lots of Holy Spirit stuff that we don't have necessarily from what the other writers are doing. And this just goes back to, like, I don't know, even as I'm hearing you're saying your last section on, John puts this here, but Matthew puts it here with Peter's denial, right?
Right.
If that's new for you hearing this could be like a crisis moment. Like, wait a minute, the Bibles are inconsistent, or there's a contradiction. And I've always been told there's not a contradiction in the Bible. Remember, these guys, like, what happened was true. What happened. they're placing these events in different areas just because there's a purpose for why they're telling their story the way they are. And that's no different than when we went through Matthew and why Matthew constructs his story in the way he did, or why Mark puts his story in the way he did, or Luke, or John does the same thing. So it would be pretty boring if we had if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were literally just the same thing 4 times. Right. These guys are telling their story in a specific way to communicate a certain thing.
Yeah, and also it's a good point. Not sure why I didn't even realize that I had said that, and how could it could be a point of crisis for some people. Realize that the early church was fine with this. Mm-hmm. I mean, they had no problem with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and not agreeing on all the details. Okay, so what's the problem? They didn't think the way we thought. They compiled these gospels together. They realized the gospels go together and went on their merry way. If they were like, quote unquote, therefore wrong, they would never have put one of them in. Okay, well, this one can't be in because that one's in. They wouldn't have done that. So it's only our modern standards to say, well, it either happened here or it happened there, and one's wrong. It's like neither one are trying to do that. They're not trying to present the facts as though, well, this is the way it happened. Mm-hmm. And John's like, no, this is the way it happened. It's like, they're not doing that. So
that really is a product of the Enlightenment and modernity in terms of how we think and how we construct things. Correct. In more linear, scientific kind of ways.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So John's gospel is, as you just mentioned, is going to have this extended speech of Jesus. So for John's gospel, they can't leave the house yet because he's got a lot to say to them. Mm-hmm. And so that's why he places what happened with Peter's denials at the beginning of, at the end of chapter 13. He's got 3 chapters of this extended speech. We just know that by chapter 17 of John's gospel, they suddenly are in the garden and he's giving his prayer there. John's not trying to worry about that. He's just inserting this particular story. So we're going to save that speech because we're going to discuss it in some detail on our John podcast, on one of our John episodes, but it's extremely significant. And the way I would maybe give a teaser now, I would say this. In the Gospel of John, the Holy Spirit is as important or more important to the story than Jesus.
Which is funny real quick, because as modern evangelicals, we love the Gospel of John because it definitively proves the divinity of Jesus and Trinitarian language. So when you hang out with the Jehovah's Witness, you go to John. This is why we love John, and we ignore the fancy word is the pneumatology of it, the Holy Spirit aspect of it. Yeah. And it's like the Holy Spirit is central to the Gospel of John from the beginning. Mm-hmm.
That's the whole point from the beginning. All the stories about water in chapters 2, 3, and 4 are pointing us to the Holy Spirit. I would say the Holy Spirit is as important or more important in the Gospel of John than Jesus is. And it's like, it's a gospel about Jesus. Like, yeah, but so the other thing maybe to point out now, since we haven't discussed John's gospel yet in our podcast series, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written maybe 20 or 30 years before the Gospel of John. John's readers know Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One of the things he's doing in the Gospel of John is kind of answering some questions that Mark's gospel specifically raised. John's kind of answering a few of those. And then John's supplementing it with things that weren't discussed in those gospels, most notably like who Jesus is and how this fits into the Old Testament story. Let's move forward then, Vinnie. And what we'll do now is note that the disciples then take us to the Garden of Gethsemane. And of course, Gethsemane means an olive press. And it says in the garden, in the olive press, there was a garden there, which is Eden language, because in Eden, there was a garden there. Remember, Eden and the garden are not synonymous. So there's Eden, and in Eden is a garden. And then there's Gethsemane, and in Gethsemane, there is a garden, and that's where Jesus goes. So it says in Matthew 26, verse 36, that he asked the disciples to wait at one particular place in the garden, and then he takes Peter, James, and John in a little bit further. And we haven't discussed this, I don't think, yet, but Peter, James, and John, we kind of refer to as the inner circle of 3 disciples. They are certain events like prayer of Jesus, for example, where only these 3 disciples are taken in, the raising of Jairus' daughter, as well as the transfiguration. Only Peter, James, and John are privileged to. And again, they definitely had a hierarchical structure with Peter at the head of it. And then Peter, James, and John, and there might have been Andrew attached to them also, but at least these 3 are privileged. And then they go in. Now, again, John's gospel has this long, extensive prayer, this high priestly prayer of John 17, Father, glorify me with the glory I had with you before the world began. And I pray that they may be one, even as we are one, which I kind of chuckle with because I'm sorry, because that's exactly what has not happened in the church, that the church has become one, even as Jesus says. But nonetheless, that's where John chapter 17 kind of fits in here. But nonetheless, Jesus tells the disciples in Matthew's account that he's filled with sorrow. and he asked them to remain and to keep watch. And this word keep watch has this implication of be ready. It doesn't mean like, hey, keep your eyes open. It's the spirit of readiness, because you need to know what's going on here. So then it says he actually went in a little farther himself. So he left 9 of the disciples kind of at the beginning of the garden. And then he takes Peter, James, and John with him. And then he says, okay, you guys stay here and keep watch. And then he goes a little bit farther. And he prays. I like Matthew's gospel in this particular part, because in Matthew's gospel, he prays, may this cup be taken from me, yet not what I will, but as you will. And we said at the beginning of our last episode that from the beginning, Jesus knew the cross was the way it was going to be. He knew all along, since he began traveling to Jerusalem, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular, he was going to Jerusalem to suffer and die. He reminds them over and over and over again. Yet he also knows what this means. And it means, I don't want to do this. And it says an angel appears to him in Luke 22 and provides comfort. And of course, that there's a spiritual battle going on without question there. Now, Luke 22, verse 44 says he sweat like drops of blood. Of course, that's probably not in the original manuscripts, nonetheless. And even if it was, it doesn't mean that he actually sweat drops of blood. It was like drops of blood.
I was going to say, this is something where this becomes one of those misnomers that you hear. Like I go through this when I teach like biblical interpretation. Even if it is part of the text and there's not a textual variant there, which there is, he sweat like drops of blood. So it's describing the intensity in which he was sweating. And because you hear sermons, someone could be so stressed out that they could physically produce this. No, that's not the point. The point is he was sweating.
No, the pastors or teachers get so excited because I can prove that Jesus actually sweat blood because there's a scientific medical explanation. It's like, it doesn't say he sweat blood. No, it was like drops of blood. And it's just this tremendous angst and anxiety and agony that he's undergoing. And I think as we go through the rest of Thursday night and Friday in the cross, it's super important to remind ourselves of the suffering of Christ. We talk so much about Jesus suffering for us on the cross. It's like, folks, he has been suffering for like the last 12 to 15 to 20 hours or more. And it began on Thursday night in the garden going, hey, Father, take this from me. Now he returns.
From an apologetic standpoint, I just want to jump in here. If you ever engage with Mormon, someone who's LDS, they actually have a theology that is built on this that says, I don't know if you're aware of this. So they would say, because he sweat drops of blood, they literalize that. Therefore, the atonement actually started in the garden. We would say, no, the atonement didn't happen in the garden, but his agony started in the garden. There was a very real thing that's happening there, but this is not the same as the cross.
It says he returns to his disciples in Matthew 26, verse 40 and 41, and found them sleeping. And then again, he goes and prays. And this time in Matthew 26, verse 42, he says, if it's not possible, may your will be done. And I find that really significant because he has just said, Father, take this cup from me, but not my will, but your will be done. And then he comes back a second time and says, okay, I guess it's not possible. So I guess your will be done. That Jesus knew in his heart, whether God spoke to him, whether he answered his prayer and said, nope, not doing that. Okay, great. And of course, Jesus is exemplifying the Lord's prayer, right? Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
With that, do you think it's important, especially in evangelical world, we love the deity of Jesus. And so we might think, oh, well, he knew the will of God because Jesus is God. And so we almost view like Jesus going through the actions. And I think this is one thing where N.T. Wright does a really good job of challenging people. I think we mentioned this earlier in a few number of podcasts back in his How God Became King book, where he mentions this, how like the evangelicals overly do it, the deity of Jesus. And so we almost have this Gnostic view of God, of Jesus, where he kind of just floats, he's not a real human. Whereas in mainline liberal theology, they underemphasize the deity of him, but then they overemphasize the humanity of him. And N.T. Wright's point is like, hey, like you need to have a complete view of Jesus. And so just challenge yourself. So this is one of those times, especially for our conservative evangelical friends, which like I'm sitting in that context. We want to just immediately turn to, well, Jesus was God, so he knew all things. He's an omniscient, not recognizing like, no, this is the hypostatic union, the big word that says how Jesus can have these two natures. He is still fully 100% man, So he is fully sweating like he's bleeding, like it's gushing, like he is freaking out. I'm thinking of the biggest anxiety attack I've ever had, or like the biggest stress moments where you're worried about something. Like this is what he's having.
Yeah.
Like and yes, he's spiritually mature enough where he will say, hey, your will, not my will, and I will follow that. But he's still engaging with those emotions.
Right. Yeah, very much so. He knows what this means, and he does not want to do it, but he's willing to do it. And that's the significance. Yeah. So he goes back and finds the disciples sleeping a second time. It says in Matthew 26, their eyes were heavy and they were exhausted from sorrow, in Luke's gospel. And again, he goes off and prays a third time. And again, a third time he comes back and they are sleeping. And of course, the three is probably very significant. We don't know what time it is. It's very late. Obviously, the disciples are sleeping. They don't want to sleep. It's not like, oh, how can they fall asleep? Because it's midnight. I mean, we don't know what time it is. It's quite late. Here's what we know. We know that a number of events happened during that night from the gospel records. Some trials before the Jewish authorities and things of that nature. They then have another trial in the morning, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And so there has to be some time lapse going on for those things. We also know that Judas has left. And it says in John 18 that Judas comes back with Roman authorities. And there's debate in more liberal scholarly circles whether they were Roman soldiers or not. I think they were. I think that Judas has gone to the authorities because here's what we know. We know earlier in the week, they said, okay, we're going to kill the guy, but not during the festival. There's just too many people in town. And the people are right now kind of on Jesus' side. So we're going to wait till after the festival is over with. Now, the Feast of Passover is a one-day feast, but the next day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this and that's a 7-day feast. So we have 8 straight days of festival. And this Passover was actually a special Passover because it happened on the day before the Sabbath. So the next day, Thursday night begins Friday. So the meal happens on Thursday night, as we call time, but that's actually Friday for them. Then the next morning, of course, the trials. The next day is the crucifixion. The next night is Friday night, which becomes officially Saturday. That Saturday now is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it's also the first day of the Sabbath. So it's a special Passover because it butts up against the Sabbath there. So it seems as though, and again, we're really speculating now because we don't know this, that Judas has left and said, hey, guys, I think he's willing to surrender himself now. In other words, what happened that changed the authorities' mind to say, okay, let's see if we can get this done now? Because you're in the middle of a festival, of a feast. And of course, like, okay, we got to get this done now because the next day's Sabbath. We can't do it then. And then we're in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. All right, let's get it done now. Something happened now. And the suspicion is, and it's only a suspicion, that Judas has gone and said, hey, guys, I think he's going to go willingly if we do it tonight. It also seems that Jesus is delaying in the garden. And note, 3 times he goes back and forth. Hey, guys, you stay here. Takes Peter, James, and John a little further. Hey, you guys stay here. He goes off and prays. He comes back. You guys are sleeping? And then he goes off and prays again. Okay, Lord, if it's not your will, then your will be done. If it's not your will that I be relieved of this, okay, great. He goes back a second time. They're still sleeping. He goes back and prays a third time. Like, why is he going back and forth? It seems as though Jesus is intentionally delaying. And the question is, how does Judas know where he's at? Well, it says in the Gospels that he often went to the garden to pray. And so he's either going to be in Bethany, if that's the city that he was staying in. John's Gospel seems to indicate that's where he was staying, that he's gone back to Bethany. He's left that, the Passover has to be eaten within the vicinity of Jerusalem. So he's eaten the Passover in Jerusalem, and now he's left and gone to Bethany. And if he's not back in Bethany, on the way to Bethany is the garden. Maybe we can find them here. And it also says that Judas identifies Jesus with a kiss. And of course, it's like, well, why would they have to identify? They know who he is. Well, I think that suggests that there's Roman soldiers involved because they don't know who he is necessarily per se. And furthermore, it indicates it's also late at night and it's dark and they've got maybe some torches out there. But note again that Jesus calls him friend and Judas betrays him with a kiss. Jesus had asked in John 18, he says, who is it that you want? And they said, well, we want Jesus of Nazareth. And then it says Judas comes up and kisses him. And then Jesus says, I am he. And they fall to the ground. Now, the reason why they fall to the ground there, I think the Gospel of John's getting this out, and our translations don't always do us justice here, is because what Jesus says is, he says, I am.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I am in English is not necessarily a complete sentence unless it's like, is anybody hungry? I am. All right, it's a complete sentence. The translations often say, I am he, but I am is essentially the definition of God's divine name. Given to Moses in the book of Exodus, of course, it actually was given to Abraham earlier on in the book of Genesis, describes his name as the Lord. The name the Lord means I am, the one who is. And I think that's what's indicated in John 18, verse 6, that they fall to the ground. Now, John's gospel then says that they cut off the high priest, a servant of the high priest's ear. And what's interesting is John names the man. His name was Malchus. And it's suggested, very likely, that John was known by the family of the high priest. So remember, as the night goes on, Jesus is going to go into the high priest's home and have a trial there. And it says John and Peter got into the courtyard. Well, if John's known by the high priest, that's how he gets in. And Peter gets in because he's with John. So, of course, now all the disciples flee. Like sheep are going to be scattered. So you guys are going to be scattered. Oh, Lord, I'm going to be willing to die with you. Well, yeah, not really, as all the disciples flee. And Jesus is now alone in this hour of great need. Again, add that now to the suffering that he's undergoing, because now he's been betrayed by his friends. I mean, Peter's going to betray him more so later on, but the disciples have already left. They're not hanging around.
It's almost a preview for what you see on the cross, where he does quote Psalm 22, where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he's already been forsaken by everyone now.
Yeah.
His earthly people. Even going back into Maundy Thursday, like the command is to love one another. Like, this is how people are going to know that you're my disciples, when you demonstrate that. Now he's in his greatest moment of need, and he's all alone.
Yeah. Now, according to the Gospel of John, they brought Jesus to a man named Annas, who used to be the high priest, and is the father-in-law of the current high priest. And you're like, what do you mean used to be the high priest? Because the high priest's office is an office for life. Well, that had gone kind of by the wayside back about 200 years before this, when the Greeks began selling the office of high priest to the highest bidder, and no longer was the high priest a man from the Zadokite family, which goes all the way back to the time of David and earlier. So by now the Romans are in charge, and the high priest is a high political office. And so Rome's like, okay, guess what? Here's what we're going to do. Annas retires, and his son-in-law, Caiaphas, becomes the high priest. But the reality is, once a high priest, always a high priest. And when you're the father of the high priest, who used to be the high priest yourself, they're going to take Jesus to you first. So John's gospel in John 18, 12 through 14, and then 19 through 23, has Jesus being questioned by Annas, but Annas has no authority. And of course, Jesus says his response is like, look, I don't know what your problem is, but I did you probably didn't say it that way, but I did everything publicly. All right. So in John 18, verse 22, it says, then one of the officers standing nearby Jesus struck him in the face and saying, is that the way you answer the high priest? And Jesus said, if I've spoken wrongly, testify the wrong. But if rightly, why do you strike me? And the answer is, look, all I said was I did everything openly in the temple courts. Why are you asking me? Because if you're asking me, you're trying to get me to incriminate myself, which actually is against Roman law also. They had the fifth back then, or something of that nature back then. He has done nothing wrong. All right, then verse 24 in John 18 says, Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now, sometimes people will make a big deal about these trials because technically they're illegal. So the famous movie, The Passion of the Christ, has all this happening in the temple courts because that's where the court actually met. But the reality is the temple courts is where they actually met, but they can only meet there legally during the daytime. So now some people will make a big deal of, oh, they're having all these illegal trials. Well, they're not having illegal trials because they don't consider these trials. That's why they have another trial in the morning, because everything that they did at night isn't legal. But what they're doing is saying, okay, we got to have our things in order because we don't have a lot of time tomorrow. Because tomorrow night at 6:00, it begins the Sabbath. And so we got to get this done by 6:00 tomorrow night. And now that meant they had to get Pilate to agree to have him crucified, because at this point in time, Pilate hasn't agreed to anything. I do think that Pilate has already been spoken to, though, because Pilate is the only one that can authorize the Roman soldiers to come and arrest Jesus. So if Roman soldiers are present at the arrest of Jesus, then Pilate has already been notified. And I think that'll make sense of some of the conversations in the morning. But nonetheless, what's happening during the night is saying, hey, let's get everything in order so that we can make sure this goes quickly in the morning when they have their legal formal trial. So they weren't doing anything behind the back, anything illegal. They knew it wasn't legal. They were just trying to get everything together. So nonetheless, they take Jesus before Caiaphas now for a more formal trial. And it says that Peter followed at a distance and was able to enter the courtyard because John knew the servant girl at the door. This is John 18, verses 15 and 16. So John knows the servant girl. She lets him in, and Peter follows in as well. But of course, the problem is, the trials at least, they can't agree on any particular formal charge. Let's go to Mark's gospel, Mark 14 right now. In Mark chapter 14, it says that they're trying to get a testimony against him, but they couldn't get any testimony. Verse 56 says, yet their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against Jesus, saying, we heard him say, I'll destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days we'll build another made without hands.
This is interesting because that's quoted in John 2, but that's actually not quoted in Mark.
That's correct. But Jesus didn't say, I will destroy the temple.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He says, destroy the temple and I'll raise it up. And he didn't say made without hands.
Yes.
But that's a reference to Daniel 2.
Yes. Yep.
Nonetheless, of course, we see the fulfillment that John and Mark and the gospel writers are seeing within the story. So, of course, it's false testimony. The problem is this, verse 59, not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. Now, the problem is this, they're trying to have Jesus crucified or have Jesus tried with a capital charge. And in that world, if someone's convicted on a capital charge, you need 2 witnesses. Mm-hmm. And if it's a stoning instance, for example, the 2 witnesses are the ones who are required to throw the first stones. Mm. Now, if the 2 witnesses, if their testimony is found out to be untrue, they are stoned. Mm-hmm. So they're like, well, if we can't get our testimonies consistent, no one's going to say, all right, I'll go up. I'll do it, because their life is on the line. So if you accuse somebody of a capital crime, a capital charge, and you give false witness, then the death sentence goes to you. So very significant. They couldn't get any charge or anyone to agree. So what happens? It says in verse 60, the high priest stood up and said, do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you? Now, Mark 14, verse 61, he kept silent, made no answer. And again, the high priest was questioning him, saying, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.
Once again, Daniel 7.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Matthew's gospel says in verse 63 of Matthew 26, it says, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now, what's happening is this, they can't find true witnesses against Jesus. And they need them, of course, to have him guilty of a capital crime. They have to have a charge that they can take to Rome, to Pilate, and say, hey, Pilate, here's what's going on. Now, mind you, blaspheming against the temple, saying I'm going to destroy it and build another one, that's blasphemous to them and worthy of death. But it's not a charge that Pilate's going to care about. I could care less what he does to this temple. If it's your building, I don't really care. Now, I care if there's an uprising in the city and my men have to get involved and I want to keep peace. And that's what Romans put me in charge to do, is to keep peace. But nonetheless, that's not an issue that he cares about. Now, what the high priest has done is he's usurped his authority to say, I charge you under oath. And when the high priest charges you under oath, you are obligated to respond. Now, the reality is, the question is, well, are you the Christ? And that is a charge that Rome will have interest in. Mm-hmm. What's your answer?
Because that's political at this point.
Because that's political.
We hear this and we're like, but that's a theological.
This is a religious debate with the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Sanhedrin and Jesus. No, it's political now. Exactly. Very, very, very perceptive. Mm-hmm. So Jesus' answer is, well, you said it. And Matthew 26, verse 64. And again, the translations can be, it's like, I think maybe the best way to translate this from the Greek would be, you're the one who is saying that I am. Those are your words. Mm-hmm. But then he adds, as we read in Mark's gospel, you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And that's a reference to Daniel 7, verse 13.
Which is also very political.
It's also yes, it's very political, because the 4 beasts are 4 kings. Mm-hmm. The Son of Man in Daniel 7 is Israel. Mm-hmm. It's the people of God. But the people of God being representative by this one representation of them as the Son of Man. But when you read Daniel 7 carefully, the Son of Man is also associated with the divine God himself, the one who sits on the throne. And so Jesus' quote of Daniel 7:13 and 14 is, yeah, and guess what? I am the Son of God, but I'm also the Son of Man who's coming on the clouds of heaven. And it's God who comes on the clouds of heaven. And in the Bible, God's the one who rides the cloud. He's the cloud rider, the cloud by day and the fire by night. God comes on a cloud. And so, of course, the high priest tears his clothes and says, he's spoken blasphemy. Matthew's gospel says they began to strike him in the face, to spit on him and say, prophesy to us, after they blindfolded him and said, if you're the Christ, who hit you? So again, the mocking, the scourging, the beating, the very ones for whom he is dying are the ones who are doing this to him. So when you talk about the suffering of Christ and the passion of Christ, you have to recognize all the things that have been transpiring throughout the entirety of the last 12 to 14 hours before he even gets on the cross.
Yeah. What I just find is interesting as well is in Mark's, I still have Mark 14 up there. It's, they began to spit on him, they cover his face, to strike him, and they say, prophesy, who did it? And the immediate passage you have after that is recalling, Peter denying Jesus.
Yes.
He denied it. Oh, that's actually the prophecy that Jesus did give to say that this is the thing that that Peter would do, was deny him. And so actually you do have a fulfilled prophecy in terms of Jesus knowing what's going to happen. But anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So if you remember when we discussed Mark's gospel, for those of you listening, we discussed the fact that Mark sandwiches stories. He'll tell a story, interrupt it with another story, and then go back to the other story. Mark sandwiches Peter's denials and Jesus's confession.
Yeah.
So Jesus tells the truth and gets himself crucified. And in the middle, Peter denies himself. Now, again, all that was illegal. It wasn't illegal in the sense that they were doing something wrong. It was in the sense that it wasn't a legal court case because
it wasn't official.
It wasn't official. They have to have a formal trial in the morning.
They don't have a quorum.
Yeah. So I would say that the trials that happened at night probably were at Caiaphas's home. And actually, if you go to Jerusalem, and most tours do not take you here, there's a place called the Burnt House in the western side of the old city. So the old city is divided into quarters. There's a Jewish quarter. So in the Jewish quarter, there's a place called the Burnt House. And if you go into the Burnt House, you go underneath the city, and you're not far from the temple, from where the temple would have stood. You're right near it. And they found these large houses, mansion-like houses, and they found stone water pots and stone earthenware all over the place. Now, the significance of that is stone is what the priests use.
Yep, it's religious. That's
it's
John
religious.
chapter 2.
It's because stone does not convey impurities. And so, and they actually found and you could see it if you go to the city of Jerusalem today, where actually it was, that there was a pathway for the priests to go from this area of Jerusalem, from their homes to the temple without touching anyone else, because they had their own entrance to the temple building. So it's very likely, I think actually it is the case, that these homes that they've discovered under the burnt house in the old city, in the western quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, are indeed the house of Caiaphas and the high priests. That they are religious homes. They're large enough to fit aristocracy. I think you can literally stand in the home where Jesus actually was there. The courtyard is inside the home, but it's an open air courtyard. So when you enter the home, you enter into a courtyard, and that courtyard now is open air. And then around that courtyard are the various rooms. So I've sat in that room. It's very, very powerful experience. You're like, okay, I'm Peter, and Jesus is in one of those rooms. Because what happens in the Gospels, it says, I think the Gospel Luke says it, that after Peter denied the third time, it says, then Jesus stared at him. So Jesus is in one of these rooms over here, and you can see the doorways are still there. And Peter's standing in this courtyard, and you're like, oh, wow, what a moment where Peter has denied knowing Jesus, and Jesus stares at him. Like, wow. All right, but nonetheless, let's go back to the morning. So sometime early in the morning, they have a trial in the morning, and the question arises again, are you the Christ? And this is Luke 22, verse 67. Jesus says, if I tell you, you won't believe me. They ask him again, are you the Son of God? And he says, okay, you're right in saying that I am. And now they've reached a decision. They brought him to Pilate, because again, They couldn't get anyone to agree on the charges against the temple, which is really serious. And when we get to the book of Acts, we'll be reminded about the fact that Jesus was speaking something against the temple, because that's a serious issue for the Jewish people, but it doesn't mean much to Pilate. What means much to Pilate is the fact that he's claiming to be the king. And that's what the word Christ ultimately means, the Messiah or the king. So now he appears before Pilate sometime early in the morning. And I put down, 7 a.m. We don't know. But nonetheless, he's brought into the palace. And again, there's two possible places here. Pilate has a palace on the western side of the old city where he spent the night, where he would stay whenever there was a festival. Now, Pilate lived in Caesarea on the coast. But whenever there's a lot of Jews in town for festivals and for feasts, and there was, of course, the Passover and unleavened bread, Pilate would stay in the city of Jerusalem because, again, his job, the role of a procurator, is to collect taxes and to keep peace. So if you're going to have an uprising, it's going to be when there's a lot of people in town. So Pilate and extra security are in town. Now, it says that the Jews could not enter the palace in the Gospel of John because they would be defiled and unable to eat, it says, the Passover meal. And there's a big question here, and we can discuss this when we do the Gospel of John, is, does John's Gospel have Jesus eating the Passover meal the night before and the actual Passover? Some say John's Gospel has Jesus crucified on Thursday. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Luke have him crucified on Friday. And the answer is no. The reason why that is this, because if you enter a Gentile's home, you're defiled for the day, but the day ends at sundown. So if the Passover meal at night is what they were talking about, meaning this happens on a Thursday in John's Gospel, they wouldn't have been worried about entering Pilate's palace on a Thursday to be defiled and not able to eat the Passover meal that evening. It can only refer to a noontime meal, a daytime meal, and the daytime meal called the Shagigah was ate on the day during the daytime on the Passover itself. I think the evidence actually is that John's Gospel also has Jesus being crucified on Friday. But nonetheless, one of the questions is Jesus having this trial? Are they having this trial at Pilate's home and his palace, or at the Roman fortress, which was attached to the temple complex, like right next, the Antonia fortress, as it's called, which is right next to or attached to the temple building itself? I don't think we know for certain, but I think this is happening at Pilate's home. So it's happening at Pilate's home, and Pilate says, okay, hey guys, what's the charge? Now, John's Gospel goes to extensive dialogue on this. And if you read the end of John 18 and John 19, you're going to get all this dialogue. But Pilate wants to know the charges against him. And the Jews appear to be alarmed. Like, what do you mean? What's the charge? It says in John 18, verse 30, it says, if he were not a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him over to you. Now, in one sense, this is no way to speak to a Roman official in charge, but it suggests, and again, we're really filling in the gaps here. We aren't certain. So just
it's called an argument from silence.
I'm not arguing. I'm filling in the gaps of the voices that we do have.
Okay.
Saying, I think this is the way to make sense of what was just said, but we can't be certain that we're actually surmising correctly. So what they said was disrespectful. Like, if we didn't have a charge, we wouldn't have brought him here. I think that suggests we told you last night when we got the guards. I think what happened is Judas left, went to the priest's home and said, hey guys, I think he's willing to do this. Remember, Jesus goes back and forth, back and forth 3 times. He's delaying for Judas to come. Something's taking a while. I think what's taking a while is he went to the Jewish authorities. They went to the Roman authorities, which is Pilate, and said, hey, can we get this done? Pilate agreed to that. All that took time. Okay, go ahead and get this battalion of Roman soldiers. And then they come now to the garden and arrest Jesus. So in the morning, when they meet with Pilate, they're like, what do you mean? What's the charge? Pilate says, take them away yourselves. And they respond, but we can't execute anyone. So then Pilate begins to interrogate Jesus himself. In John 18, it says, are you the king of the Jews? In John 18, verse 33. And of course, Jesus again is silent. It says in verse 33, Pilate entered into the praetorium and he summoned Jesus and said, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus said, well, look, are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Which is also a little bit of almost disrespectful, because of course, Pilate doesn't know anything other than what the Jewish authorities have said. And Pilate said, I'm not a Jew, am I? Which really tells you, by the way, how much the Roman world was anti-Semitic. Yeah. And Pilate was actually very anti-Semitic. And if we had time to do a podcast on like the New Testament backgrounds or the historical backgrounds, Pilate was not in a good place right now. And actually, this is relevant to the story here. Pilate has gotten himself in trouble with the Jewish authorities on several occasions, and they've gone to Rome and told on him. And he can't afford to get himself in much trouble again. So, I mean, Pilate is the Roman authority. If he says, look, I don't think he's worthy of death, then it's done. But it's not done because Pilate is in a precarious position with the Jewish authorities. And if they go to Rome again, he's going to be in a lot of trouble. So he says, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation, the chief priest, delivered you to me. What have you done? And Jesus said, okay, my kingdom's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to you, over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. And again, it's important to recognize a couple things here. One is he's not talking about a spiritual kingdom up in heaven. He's talking about the place of his kingdom is not this worldly, but it's a heavenly kingdom where God rules from. And the heavenly kingdom is going to overwhelm the kingdoms of the world. So it's very much a this worldly kingdom, but only in the sense that it's ruled by God from heaven itself, who will eventually overtake the kingdoms of this world. Number one. Number two, his reference to the fact that my kingdom is not of this world. I don't do things the way the world does things. The world does power by warfare. The world does power by stepping on the little guy. I do power by dying for the sake of the other. And the reason why I point this out here is because people make a big deal of the fact that Peter had a sword and hacked off the high priest's ear. And we'll talk about this on our, hacked off the servant of the high priest's ear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Jesus, he also immediately rebukes him for doing that.
And he heals the guy.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And we're going to talk about this on our fourth podcast that you and I are going to do on the Gospel of Luke as well, because, Jesus told them, if you don't have a sword, go sell your stuff and buy one. There's no way he meant that literally. If he meant that literally, then why would he come out and tell Pilate, members of my kingdom, they don't wage war like you guys do. They don't come out fighting. And when Peter does use the sword, he heals the guy and says, guys, this is not the way we do things around here. So Pilate says, okay, so you are a king. And he's like, well, yeah, I am. And for this reason, this is verse 37 of John 18. For this reason, I've been born. And for this reason, I've come to testify to the truth. And everyone who's of the truth hears my voice. And then Pilate said, what is the truth? Isn't that the most incredible question in all of human history? Because the answer is standing right in front of you.
Yeah.
I'm the truth. And Pilate's like, what is the truth? And it's like, well, hello, me. So it says, then Pilate went out and said, I find no guilt in him. And of course, you're like, well, this is not going to work, Pilate. I don't care if you find guilt in him or not. We have to have this guy crucified. Now, Pilate then says in John's gospel, and of course, Matthew, Mark, and Luke also have this happening in their gospels also, hey, we have a policy here to release a criminal. So he says, hey, here's the deal. We have this idea, this policy that I can release a criminal. And here's the deal. What do you want me to do? And they say, Jesus or Barabbas. Now, very briefly here, I mentioned this. There's no way the man's name was Barabbas.
Yes.
Because bar is, of course, the Aramaic word for son of, and Abba is the Aramaic word for father. Who names their son a son of a father? Matthew's gospel has a note, well, it's a textual variant in Matthew 27, verse 16, that says his name was Jesus Barabbas. And
the textual variant means there's some Greek manuscripts that contain this.
That contain this. And this is a very common testimony in the early church. In other words, the gospel writers nickname him Barabbas because of the contrast. There's a man named Jesus Barabbas, Jesus, a son of a father, or Jesus, the son of the father. In other words, who do you want me to release? Jesus, a son of a father, or Jesus, the son of the father? And the gospel writers seem to be picking up on this. What happens is it says that Barabbas was an insurrectionist and guilty of murder. And this is a serious issue. What it means is that he has probably killed a Roman official or a Roman individual as a way of starting an insurrection against Rome. And whenever an insurrection against Rome started, Rome would punish everyone. So if this guy gets released and goes out and kills another Roman official, we're all going to get punished again. Pilate seems to be certain you're going to totally let Jesus, the Son of God, go and have me have Barabbas, Jesus Barabbas, killed. And they say
that's
no.
significant though, because we oftentimes get the idea, especially living in the West, where like this is merely the judge letting the criminal off the hook who did something bad. And it's like, no, it's not merely that this guy gets to go free and doesn't get what's due to him. There's a societal implication for what he did.
Yeah.
And this is what they're choosing. No, we would rather allow this and risk getting in trouble again and getting the thumbs of Rome smashed on us. We would rather have that than let Jesus go.
Right. And of course, now all this is because the authorities are the ones who are influencing the crowd, most likely there to do these things. Now, Pilate then responds by saying, well, what do you want me to do with Jesus? And they say, crucify, crucify. Pilate says, like, why? What crime has he committed? And then Pilate goes into the palace. And this is another place where the movie The Passion, I think, made a mistake, because it says that Pilate goes into the palace and has Jesus flogged. This is John 19 now. He has Jesus flogged, given a crown of thorns and a purple robe, and they hail him as King of the Jews. They struck him on the face, spit on him, hit him with their staff, and paid homage to him. This is all prior to the crucifixion. In other words, he has not been sent away to be crucified yet. So he's flogged twice, in other words. This flogging is not the flogging that precedes the crucifixion. This is a separate flogging. And the idea is this. Pilate brings Jesus out of the palace now. Remember, the Jewish authorities cannot go into the palace because you're going into a Gentile's home and you'll be defiled. And he says, here is the man, John 19, verse 5. Ecce homo. Now, of course, you got to remember the Gospel of John began with in the beginning, reminding us of God and creation and the creation of Adam and Eve. Here is the man. Yes, the true human is here. And they say, crucify, crucify. Still, Pilate goes inside, asks Jesus some more questions according to John's Gospel. He refuses to answer. And Pilate says in verse 10 in John 19, he says, don't you realize that I have the power to free you or to crucify you? And Jesus says, you have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. And this just reminds
the wrong thing to say.
Yeah. Well, like, what is the truth was the wrong thing to say a long time ago too, right? It reminds again that of God's sovereignty, even over wicked rulers. And this is just important to keep in mind when we get to the book of Romans now, right? So Pilate goes out to the Jews again. He tries to get Jesus freed. The Jews refuse to compromise. Pilate says he washes his hands, according to Matthew's gospel, says, I'm innocent of this man's blood, which, by the way, no, you're not. You can claim to be innocent all you want, but you are the authority in charge. And when you hand him over to be crucified, to your own men to do the crucifying, you are the one who is guilty. So Pilate says, okay, I'll have this done. Fine, whatever it is. I'm out of this, whatever. They bring Jesus to the stone pavement. Pilate says, here is your king, in John 19, verse 14. And they say, crucify him. Shall I crucify your king? Pilate says in verse 15. And they say, we have no king but Caesar. Now, again, this is significant because if Pilate does not have him crucified now, the Jews have said, we're good Romans, not citizens, but members of the Roman Empire. We only have one king, and it's not that guy. And if Pilate does not have a man crucified who has been claiming to be a king, they're going to go tell Rome on him because this is treason. What do you mean you didn't have this guy crucified? What's going on here? So, of course, Pilate hands him over to be crucified. And now he's handed over to be flogged. And this is the flogging now that precedes the crucifixion. So if you watch the movie The Passion, they only have him flogged one time and they begin counting the very first time. Now, there's two problems with that. Number one is he's flogged twice. The first time at the beginning of John 19, and look how bloody he is, behold the man. And now this time here. The second reason why there's a problem with the counting is because the Romans are doing the flogging and the Jews count, the Romans don't. In the Jewish law, you cannot be flogged more than 40 times. And in order to make sure that they didn't break the law, they only flogged you 39 times in case they miscounted it somewhere along the line. Is that number 18 or are we on 19 now? But the reality is the Romans don't care. The man who's doing the flogging is an executioner. And if he kills you during the flogging, he did his job. Now, the goal is to get you on the cross because it's shameful. It's despicable. Everybody can see what happens to you. It's a warning to everybody else. Don't do whatever this man did. So they want to get you on a cross. But if they don't get you on a cross because they killed you beforehand, it's just one less cross they need that day. It doesn't matter to them. No one's in trouble. So the idea that they counted and only whipped Jesus 39 times, is probably not correct. The whip that they use, of course, is there's these balls of lead that just smack against your flesh, but they also have bone woven into the leather strips, and it's going to rip your flesh out as well as they tear it back. It's immensely tragic and significant amount of blood loss and a significant amount of pain. That's why when Jesus is on the cross, he says, "I am thirsty." It's because what happens is when you lose that much blood, all your bodily fluids go to replacing the blood, and you dry up in the mouth immediately. Now what happens, of course, is that they begin the journey to Golgotha, or the place of the skull. As he begins to journey to the place of the skull, which is outside the city walls now. So again, he was probably in Pilate's palace where he had the charges brought against him. They brought him to the Antonia Fortress to have him beaten, which is on the other side of Old City now, not that far away, but nonetheless the other side of the Old City. And now they begin to march back towards Pilate's residence, because that's where the crucifixion site was. I do personally believe that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is likely the correct place. It's the best location that we have. The Garden Tomb, if you go to modern day Jerusalem, is not correct because it's outside the city wall, but the city wall that it's outside of didn't exist at the time of Jesus. It was built later. So the tomb of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right outside the city wall on a main highway, fits well. Unable to carry his cross, they have a man named Simon of Cyrene who carries the crossbar. Women are following. They're hurling insults at him, and they bring him to the place of the skull, or the place called Golgotha, which is Aramaic for the place of the skull. In Latin, of course, it's Calvary. And there he's crucified. Again, they put a sign above his head, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, which in Latin, INRI, Iesu, Nazareth, Rex, R for Rex, a king, E of the Jews, Eudias. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And there's two criminals, one on each side. And the two criminals are also lestai, or robbers, or murderers, insurrectionists. And of course, we discussed this, the two brothers, James and John, say, "Hey, Jesus, can we sit on your right and on your left?" It's like, you don't want to be sitting on my right and on my left when I'm being coronated as king, because that's reserved for me. These two people crucified with him would best be defined as terrorists. That's what they are. But one of them, of course, confesses Jesus. Jesus says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise."
Even right there, because the idea is it's a thief. So we have the idea like, oh, it's just this guy who was this petty thief who's now has a capital crime. No, it's bigger than that.
Yeah, that's right. Man guilty of insurrection, very likely. The cross itself was intended to produce agony. It was not intended to produce death.
These are long deaths.
These were intentionally long deaths. Roman literature tells us that people could be hanged for 3 to 4 days. There's nothing about hanging on a cross that's going to kill you, because if you're nailed to the cross, the blood's going to coagulate around the wounds. The only way you're going to die is by exhaustion. You get so exhausted, you literally cannot breathe out. You cannot push the air out, and you die by asphyxiation. The Roman world had a law that Roman citizens could not be crucified. It was against the law to crucify a Roman citizen, though they still found ways to break that law if need be. But nonetheless, if you're a Roman citizen, in fact, one Roman historian says, you shouldn't even consider the idea that you should ever die by crucifixion. And it's likely that the Latin word excruciating comes out of the death by the cross, because they coin a new term to describe how painful it was. Ex for out of, cruciating, out of the cross.
Yeah. Although the Romans didn't invent the crucifixion.
No, they
that
did
was
not.
The Assyrians, right? Like 600 years before that.
Yeah. As far as I know, it goes back at least several hundred years before them. I know the Greeks practiced it, and I think you're probably right with the Assyrians also, as much as 500 to 600 years earlier. That's correct.
Just to show,
they perfected it, though.
Here's how brutal it was from what I've studied on it. The way the Assyrians would do it, they would leave these stakes in the ground. And they would take a body. I'm showing you. So imagine like a pencil sticking straight up with the sharp edge up top. And they perfected where the organs were at. And they would have the person impaled, but to not like actually hit the vital organs. And they would just sit there, and they could sit there in this road for days. And just until they die. And so this is where the Rome, from that tradition, this is what this thing is. And it serves as this warning and just this ultimate form of punishment. And it's just awful. It's just the most like disgusting, awful thing you could think of. Yeah,
it's unbelievable. All right, let's finish this up here quickly. And again, reminder that we mentioned this on the last episode, that if you're listening, I'm going to put in the show notes, I'm going to put an outline of some of all these verses for your sake, so you can have reference and follow along there as well. But Jesus is on the cross. They offer him a drink, which he refuses. There's a couple of caveats that happen with crucifixions in the Jewish world. Number one is the book of Deuteronomy says, in Deuteronomy 21, it says, if anyone's hung on a tree, he's cursed.
Mm-hmm.
If he's hung on a tree overnight, the land is cursed, which means we're all under that curse.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Romans brought crucifixion into the land of the Jewish world, Palestina, whatever you want to call it at this particular time, Judea and Samaria, the Jews had to decide, is the curse of Deuteronomy 21 applicable with death on a cross? Because is it a tree or not? And they decided, yes, it is. So when the Romans bring this in, they're like, hey, here's the problem. You can crucify this guy, but you have to get him down before sundown. Because at sundown, we're all under God's curse, and we're not going to allow that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Rome was interested in maintaining order in the society. So hence this idea, hey, I'm going to release a prisoner for you at the festival. We're going to give and take a little bit here and there. You're going to maintain peace, and I'm going to maintain some semblance of order. I'll crack down on you when I need to, but I'll also show some mercy every once in a while, just so that you'll stay in peace. What the Jews did is they went to Rome and said, look, here's the deal. Number one, you can't crucify them naked. Not going to happen. So very likely Jesus has, of course, a loincloth on. They cast lots for his garments. That would be his outer robe, but he still has a loincloth on. Secondly, there were some women in Jerusalem. We know this from Josephus, who's a Jewish historian shortly after the time of Jesus. And he makes reference to the fact that some women in Jerusalem felt so much compassion for people who were dying on the cross that they gave a sedative.
Mm.
These women would give a sedative to numb the pain. And Jesus refuses it. But then later on, he does receive a drink and he says, I am thirsty. There's one last thing here, and that's this. And of course, a lot of Protestants have never heard of this. It's called the 7 last words of Christ. You can take 7 sayings of Jesus that appear to be like his last sayings. It's the last words of Jesus. So Luke 23, verse 34, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Luke 23, verse 43, today you'll be with me in paradise. John 19, verse 27, woman, behold your son, and behold your mother. Mark 15, verse 34, my God, why have you forsaken me? John 19, verse 28, I am thirsty. John 19, verse 30, it is finished. And Luke 23, verse 46, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. One of the things that's significant of what we call the 7 last words of Christ is that even on the cross, he is showing concern for the sake of the other. Look, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. To the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. Woman, behold your son. Now, there's one more thing about the crucifixion that I was going to mention also, and that's this. Because the Romans had this law, the Jews had this conviction that if they die by crucifixion, they're under a curse and the whole land is cursed if it's overnight. The Romans did not allow crucified victims in Judea and Samaria to remain on the cross overnight, and they would come by and break their legs because that would hasten death. Because once your legs are broken, you can't push up. You're using your feet to push up.
And you need to push up in order to breathe.
Yeah, in order to breathe.
Mm-hmm.
You can't get the breath out. When they get to Jesus, they go to break his legs and they're like, this guy's already dead. And of course, I think it's maybe theologically interesting, the fact that Jesus controls the hour of his death or the moment of his death. It says, into your hands, I commit my spirit. And then he dies. Jesus remained in control the whole time is possibly what the authors might want us to take on that. What's significant, and we're going to discuss this in our Gospel of John study, so I won't give the answer away now, but it's they pierce his side to say, hey, they poke him to see if he's dead. Mm-hmm. Now, a right-handed soldier is going to poke him most likely on his left, on Jesus' right-hand side as they're looking at him, and up into the heart. And when they poke him, blood and water come pouring out. And in order to know the significance of blood and water pouring out, you have to pay attention to our John podcast that'll come up in about 4 or 5 weeks. Mm-hmm. And we'll discuss that. But it's extremely significant. I will also discuss it in our Genesis study that we're doing. If you're listening to this live in 2022, we're going to start a Genesis study on Wednesday nights. And if you send me an email, I'll go ahead and send you a link for that class. And we're going to post those recordings on the podcast also. We're going to backdate them to sometime in mid to late April, so you can look at those then.
That's it. We have, this culminates in the Passion Week, Good Friday, the worst Saturday ever followed by the best Sunday ever.
Yeah. And of course, we'll talk about this in the Gospel of John, because it's Saturday is the seventh day, and Jesus is doing what? He's resting.
Mm-hmm.
And then John 20 verse 1 says, 21 verse 1, on the first day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
And then it repeats it again, I think in verse 19, on the first day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
It's the first day of the new creation.
Mm-hmm. As we've been talking about, please, when you're listening to the podcast, go in there, like it, and leave a review. And this isn't for us. We don't need the kudos. We do this as a blessing, but by doing that, that's just going to get it into the algorithm more, and it's going to get it out to more people. So that's just going to help us out together as a team as we do this. This has been good though, man. Like just even prepping for this, I feel like I'm fortunate that I'm in a church that we actually will do a Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday service, and it's very meaningful. But this is a good way to help prep for that, because the pastor can't preach through all this type of stuff. So just as a way to, sit and reflect as we prepare for the specific of this. This is not merely an Easter service, which is, I know we just kind of make it like just a celebration, just this one day that it's just a holiday, but it's more than that. This is the day that is the prototype for every Sunday.
Yeah, that's right. And the cross is also the prototype for Christian living.
Mm-hmm.
Go and do thou likewise.
Yeah. Which is, we've used the phrase by Mike Gorman, a cruciform life, a cross-shaped life.
Yeah.
So great. Hey, hopefully this is blessing everyone. Give us input, give us feedback if you ever want to hear anything or have questions about what's coming up. We'll continue into the Luke series and move through as we just absolutely plow through the New Testament. We were moving so quickly. It's actually pretty good, but hopefully these are blessing you, and check the show notes for resources and come back next week. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please subscribe to like our podcast. You can follow Rob's blog at determinedtruth.com or purchase his books on amazon.com. See you next time.
I hope that worked out well.
I think it's a really good, it's going to be a good one. What's really cool, the way we started doing